It is June 10th, 1912, 7 in the morning.
Right. And we're in this quiet Iowa town called Villisca. The population is about 2,500. And there's a neighbor named Mary Peckham who steps out and immediately notices something is just wrong.
Yeah, because it doesn't begin with a scream or, commotion. It begins with this eerie, unnatural stillness, a disruption in the everyday rhythm of this farming community.
Exactly. A town like that, it operates on a very specific acoustic schedule,
Oh,
right?
absolutely. The crowing of roosters, the clanking of milk pails, heavy wooden doors opening, neighbors talking over fences.
But at the house 3 doors down from Mary Peckham, there's none of that. It's just this heavy, absolute silence.
And that's the Moore family residence. From Mary's vantage point, looking across the dewy grass, these physical anomalies are starting to stack up really quickly.
Uh-huh. Like what?
Well, the chickens in the Moore's yard are restless. They're
Sure.
pacing around the dirt. The farm animals clearly haven't been fed.
Which is a huge red flag in 1912. Morning chores are the literal lifeblood of a rural household. They cannot just be left undone.
Right, and most chillingly, it's the curtains. Every single curtain on every window of this two-story white frame house is drawn completely tight against the morning sun.
I mean, you really have to put yourself in the mindset of the era. A house locked up tight with drawn shades at 7 in the morning on a Monday. That isn't just unusual.
It's an alarm bell.
Yes. It defies the entire social contract of the town. People rose with the sun. If you were shuttered in daylight, it meant severe illness or, something far worse.
So Mary Peckham observes this, right? She waits, she's watching the house, probably expecting Josiah Moore to step out onto the porch, stretch, apologize for oversleeping.
But he doesn't.
No, the stillness just persists. So eventually this unease in her gut just drives her across the yard. She walks up those wooden steps, steps onto the porch, and she knocks on the door.
God, just imagine that sound echoing in the quiet air, that sharp, solitary rap of knuckles on wood, and then just the suffocating silence that follows it.
Nothing. No floorboards creaking,
Yeah.
no muffled voices of the 6 children who should definitely be rushing around getting ready for the day. Just nothing.
Wow.
So Mary tries the doorknob, and it turns in her hand. The door is entirely unlocked. It just swings open into this dark hallway.
And what she finds inside that house, hidden in the gloom behind those drawn curtains, it's going to haunt Villisca, Iowa for the next 113 years.
Yeah, it's a scene of such methodical, absolute devastation. It completely shatters the town's innocence.
It's the kind of violence that draws a permanent line through history, There's Villisca before Juneteenth, and there's Villisca after.
But the thing is, it isn't just the sheer brutality of what lies in those bedrooms that makes this case immortal. Our deep dive today covers over a century of police archives, trial transcripts, modern forensic data, and they all point toward this one singular, terrifying truth.
Right, because what investigators find alongside the bodies is a detail so strange, so deliberate, and honestly so impossible to explain that it has never been satisfactorily answered.
Never. Not by the local police in 1912, not by the private detectives who spent a decade chasing ghosts across the Midwestern rail lines, and not by the century of researchers who've obsessed over the file since.
Because the killer left behind a staging a post-crime ritual that completely defies every conventional logic of murder or robbery or revenge.
But to understand the madness of that crime, we really first have to understand the illusion of safety that it destroyed. So let's look at Villisca, Iowa, in June 1912.
In the language of the era, Villisca was considered a crown jewel of the state's small towns. It sat prominently right along the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad.
And that railroad connection is crucial, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It meant Villisca wasn't some fading, isolated backwater. It was a thriving agricultural hub. 2,500 residents, a bustling town square, brick storefronts, this grand Presbyterian church.
The trains brought commerce and daily newspapers from Chicago.
Exactly. It was the very picture of the American dream at the dawn of the 20th century.
And it was a town built on this foundation of profound, almost naive trust. The kind of trust where neighbors knew your exact schedule, where they genuinely watched out for your kids.
Right. And crucially for this timeline, it was a place where most people didn't even bother to lock their doors at night. Leaving the door unlocked wasn't carelessness. It was basically a status symbol of their collective security.
And the Moore family certainly didn't lock their door on the night of June 9th. They were totally woven into the fabric of Villisca's success. They were the archetype of the town's values.
Let's talk about who the Moores actually were, because their status makes them highly unlikely targets for random violence.
Okay, so Josiah Moore, everyone called him Joe. He was 43 years old,
Yeah.
highly successful businessman.
If you were a farmer in Montgomery County and you needed a plow or a tractor, you probably bought it from Joe. That kind of enterprise makes a man economically vital.
Yeah,
And his wife, Sarah Moore, she was 39, equally central to the community, but more in the social and spiritual spheres. She played piano for the Presbyterian Church. Together, Joe and Sarah really represented the absolute center of Villisca's social hierarchy. And they achieved this not through ruthless wealth, but through service and honest business.
they were the family you looked up to. And then there were their children, Herman, who was 11, Mary Catherine, 10, Arthur, 7, and little Paul, the youngest, who was just 5 years old.
4 kids growing up in the idyllic heartland. June 9th was a Sunday. The entire Moore family attended the Children's Day service at the Presbyterian Church. And 2 of the children participating in that program were friends of 10-year-old Mary Catherine Moore. They were sisters. Lena Stillinger, who was 12, and her younger sister, Ina Stillinger, who was 8.
Now, the Stillingers lived on a working farm about 7 miles outside of Villisca proper, so they had come into town specifically to take part in the Children's Day exercises.
And here is where the timeline introduces this heartbreaking, seemingly innocent coincidence. Because the Stillingers lived out of town and the evening program ran late, the sisters asked if they could stay the night at the Moore house rather than make that long, dark, horse-drawn trip back to their farm.
Yeah, and Josiah Moore agreed immediately. He walked over to a telephone, which, was still a relative luxury in 1912, but one he had access to, and he called the Stillinger home. He spoke to the girl's older sister, Blanche, and got official permission for Lena and Ina to sleep over.
It's just a simple act of Midwestern hospitality, a father looking out for his daughter's friends, making sure they had a safe, warm place to sleep. He had absolutely no way of knowing he was sealing their fate, anchoring them to a location that was about to become a slaughterhouse.
So the Children's Day program wraps up. The congregation mingles, they say their goodbyes, and begin to disperse into the night. Around 9:30 p.m., the Moore family, now joined by Lena and Ina, begin the short walk home. It was only about a 3-block journey from the church to their front door.
I really want you to picture that walk. It's 9:30 at night in early June. The air is cool, the sky is heavily clouded over, blanketing the stars and casting the town in these deep shadows. Typical, quiet Iowa summer night.
You can probably hear the dirt and gravel crunching under their leather shoes. The kids are likely chattering about the performance, the adults walking a few paces behind.
Right. They walked past the darkened storefronts, past the homes of their sleeping neighbors. They arrived at their white frame house, walked up the wooden steps, and went inside.
And, keeping with the tradition of the town, they did not lock the door behind them.
No one who saw them walking home that night, no neighbor peering out a window, no late-night stroller passing by, could have possibly known they were watching ghosts. They had no idea this was their final walk, that the warm, seemingly impenetrable, safe cocoon of the Moore house was already compromised.
Because by the morning of June 10th, 8 people inside that house were dead.
8 lives extinguished in a matter of hours, in the dark.
6 of them were children.
Yeah, 6 children. You really just have to let that sit in the room with you for a second.
And no one was ever convicted.
Yeah.
This is case file number 3. We are going to walk you through every single piece of evidence, the grisly crime scene, the botched investigation, the suspects, and the one terrifying question that official investigators could not answer even after a decade of trying.
Because the facts of the murders, while horrific, they do follow a recognizable grim physics. Someone entered that house while the family slept. Someone took an axe that belonged to Josiah Moore himself. Someone systematically bludgeoned 8 people in their beds.
But before this killer vanished into the pre-dawn fog, they performed a series of actions that defy all criminal psychology. Actions that elevate this from a mass murder to something deeply, chillingly ritualistic.
Exactly. We will dissect that ritual. But first, we really need to examine the anatomy of the massacre itself.
The timeline established by the medical examiners places the murders between midnight and 5 a.m. on the morning of June 10th. The house had completely settled. The family and their 2 young guests were in a deep slumber.
And the killer did not force entry. There were no broken windows, no splintered door frames. They were either already inside, waiting, or they simply turned the brass knob of that unlocked front door, stepped into the quiet hallway, and listened to the breathing of the house.
They found Josiah Moore's axe. This heavy, brutal tool meant for chopping dense wood, likely just kept in the coal shed or left casually in the yard.
The progression through the house was systematic, utterly silent and ruthlessly efficient. The killer started upstairs. They bypassed the downstairs guest room completely, moving first into the master bedroom where Josiah and Sarah Moore were asleep.
The attack was sudden and overwhelming. There was no time for a scream, no time to fight back. Josiah Moore was the first target. And we need to look closely at the forensic psychology here, because the violence directed at him was deeply personal and exceptionally severe compared to the rest of the victims.
It's a vital piece of the puzzle. Investigators and medical examiners noted this terrifying distinction. Josiah received significantly more blows than anyone else in the house. And crucially, the killer used only the blade side of the axe on Josiah specifically.
Right, and if you consider the biomechanics of that, swinging a heavy broad axe with the sharp edge requires a specific kind of focused trajectory.
It does. It's meant to cleave, to destroy completely. It takes immense physical exertion to repeatedly strike with the blade in the dark. The sheer number of blows suggests an explosive rage or a highly specific focus directed entirely at the patriarch. He wasn't just being neutralized so the killer could move on. He was the primary target of the fury.
But the moment the killer moved to Sarah Moore, who was in the exact same bed, the weapon was turned. The killer used the blunt side of the axe head, the heavy hammer-like side, to strike Sarah.
And they would continue to use that blunt side for every other victim in the house. The blade was reserved exclusively for Josiah.
The killer then moved from the master bedroom into the children's rooms, still up on the second floor. Herman, Mary Catherine, Arthur, and Paul, ranging in age from 11 down to 5. All of them tucked into their beds. All of them bludgeoned with the blunt side of the axe.
The medical testimony on this point offers just a microscopic sliver of mercy inside this boundless horror. The examiners indicated, based on the blood spatter and the positioning of the bodies, that the children were almost certainly asleep when the blows landed.
So they didn't wake up?
No. They died instantly in the dark. They would not have known what was happening. They never saw the shadows standing over their beds.
With the second floor silenced, the killer walked back down the wooden stairs, past the parlor, into the downstairs guest room. This was where the two visitors, 12-year-old Lena and 8-year-old Ina Stillinger, were sleeping.
And here, that silent, flawless execution of the massacre broke down, just for a fraction of a second. But a fraction of a second is enough to reveal an agonizing detail about the reality of that night.
Yeah. Ina was killed exactly like the Moore children upstairs, asleep, unaware. But Lena, 12-year-old Lena, was different. When investigators finally entered that room, they found she was not lying peacefully under the covers. She was lying askew, pushed across the bed, completely out of alignment.
The physical evidence was undeniable. Lena had distinct defensive wounds on her arms.
She was the only victim in the entire house who woke up.
I want you to try and grasp the absolute terror of that realization. A 12-year-old girl waking up in a strange house, in the pitch black of a strange room. Hearing the floorboards creak, or maybe the sickening, heavy thud of the axe striking her little sister beside her.
Realizing something is in the room.
Trying to push away, throwing her small arms up to stop a heavy iron weapon she can barely even see, she fought back. She fought for her life. But she was 12 years old, and the man with the axe was relentless.
8 people, 6 children, all killed in the same house, in the same night, with the same weapon. The massacre was complete. The house was dead. At this point, the killer could have dropped the axe on the floorboards, walked out the front door, and vanished into the pre-dawn fog.
That is what a transient killer does. That is what a panicked burglar does.
But they didn't. Instead, the killer did something that had absolutely nothing to do with murder.
No, it was entirely different.
The axe, heavy with the blood of 8 people, was carried downstairs. It was not discarded in a panic. It was left in the downstairs bedroom. But first, it was wiped partially clean.
Think about the adrenaline coursing through a human body after committing an act of such extreme, sustained physical violence. Your heart rate is astronomical. Your instinct is flight.
Right, get out of there.
Exactly. To pause, to methodically wipe the blade of the axe. It shows a chilling deceleration, a moment of calculated calm after an explosion of unparalleled butchery.
But wiping the axe is just the beginning of the impossibility here. The killer walked out of the bedrooms and into the kitchen. They opened the icebox. They took out a slab of raw bacon, roughly 2 pounds of completely uncooked, cured meat. They carried this raw bacon back into the house and placed it deliberately on the floor near the murder weapon.
Raw bacon. Let's really analyze this because it breaks the brains of criminologists. It wasn't taken to eat. There were no bite marks. It wasn't dropped by accident on the way out the door. It was transported from the icebox and specifically staged on the floor next to the axe. What does it mean?
Well, some early theories suggested the killer brought it to distract a guard dog.
But there's a massive hole in that theory.
Yeah, the Moores didn't own a dog. There was no dog in the house to distract.
Exactly. So if it's not practical, it must be symbolic. In the annals of criminal history, this is an anomaly that stops investigators in their tracks. Is it a calling card? Is it a bizarre offering? A piece of a deranged, deeply personal ritual?
And the staging continued. A kerosene lamp was found at the foot of Josiah and Sarah's bed upstairs. The killer had lit it, but before leaving it, they deliberately removed the glass chimney, the protective glass cylinder that surrounds the wick and the flame. They set the glass aside and left the exposed, naked flame burning in the room with the bodies.
Anyone who has operated a vintage kerosene lamp knows the physics of what happens when you remove that chimney. It is incredibly dangerous. The chimney controls the airflow. Without it, the flame flares up wildly, producing thick, black soot and drastically increasing the risk of setting the surrounding area, the bed sheets, the wooden floor on fire.
So to do this intentionally is to invite a conflagration.
It's an arsonist's move. Or it serves a deeply symbolic purpose. A naked flame, unguarded, burning bright and chaotic, left as a beacon in the presence of the dead.
And then we come to the detail that really defines the Villisca Axe murders. The detail that investigators could not wrap their minds around in 1912 and still cannot today. The killer walked through the entire house, room by room, and approached every single mirror.
Every mirror. The vanity in the master bedroom, the washroom mirrors, the decorative glass in the hallway.
The killer found clothing, bed sheets, aprons, whatever fabrics were at hand in each specific room, and carefully draped them over the reflective glass. Every mirror in the house was covered, blinded. Now, I have to push back here for a second. Could the killer have simply been using these clothes to wipe the blood off themselves and just discarded them on the furniture?
It's a logical question, but the crime scene photos and testimony say otherwise. These weren't discarded rags tossed casually aside. They were meticulously draped. They were pinned or arranged to ensure no part of the blast was visible.
Wow.
Yeah, think about the psychology required for this. You have just butchered 8 human beings. You should be putting as much distance between yourself and the gallows as humanly possible. Instead, you linger. You wander the dark, blood-soaked halls of this quiet home, hunting down mirrors and covering them up. This is a deliberate, time-consuming ritual.
The windows, too, received this treatment. Where the curtains were drawn tight, the killer left them. But in rooms or doors where there were no curtains, the killer used skirts and aprons, pitting them up to cover the glass. They ensured that no one passing outside could see in.
And perhaps they ensured that whatever was inside could not look out. It creates a sealed tomb, a closed ecosystem of death and ritual meticulously curated by a mind we cannot comprehend.
Were they terrified of seeing what they had become? Was that an act of profound guilt, refusing to look at the monster in the reflection?
Or were they adhering to a dark, specific set of supernatural rules?
Right. But perhaps the most terrifying physical evidence of all was found not in the bedrooms, but above them. In the attic.
Oh.
Yeah. The Moore house had a cramped, low-ceilinged attic space. Unfinished, dusty, stiflingly hot in the summer heat. When investigators finally searched it, they found cigarette butts scattered on the floorboards.
Let that image crystallize in your mind. The killer didn't follow the family home from the church. The killer was already there.
The killer had entered the unlocked house while the family was at the Children's Day service. They climbed the stairs, opened the small door to the attic, and crawled inside.
I want you to imagine the sheer terror, the absolute psychological discipline of this reality. Imagine the killer sitting in that oppressive, dark, 120-degree space, smoking cheap cigarettes in absolute silence for hours, listening.
Listening as the front door opens. Listening as Josiah and Sarah bring their children and the Stillinger girls inside.
Listening to the voices, the laughter, the sound of footsteps on the floorboards directly beneath them. Listening as the house gets ready for bed, the creak of the mattress springs, the soft goodnights. And then the killer waits even longer, smoking in the dark, waiting for the breathing below to slow, to deepen into the steady rhythm of sleep.
This is the agonizing reality that Mary Peckham's discovery opened up. The waiting killer in the attic, the raw bacon on the floor, the exposed, flaring flame, the blinded mirrors. These are the elements that official investigators could not close.
Because the murders themselves follow a grim logic. A person with a weapon and a motive kills. But the post-crime staging, the covered mirrors, had no investigative explanation. None.
And the bizarre nature of the crime scene was only compounded fatally by what happened in the hours immediately following Mary Peckham's discovery. This brings us to the contamination of case file number 3, the total destruction of evidence.
Right. If the killer's ritual was a masterpiece of macabre staging, the town's reaction was a masterpiece of forensic destruction.
Remember, Mary Peckham discovered the scene around 7:00 a.m. Word spread through Villisca like wildfire. Joe Moore's family has been murdered. By mid-morning on June 10th, long before any proper investigative perimeter could be secured by the overwhelmed local marshal, the town descended on the Moore house.
Hundreds of Villisca residents, neighbors, business associates, morbidly curious townspeople walked right through the front door.
It's almost unfathomable to a modern listener. Today, a crime scene is locked down with yellow tape, guarded by armed officers, processed by technicians in sterile suits. We understand Locard's exchange principle, that every contact leaves a trace.
But in 1912 Villisca, it was an open house of horrors. People walked through the blood in the hallways, they touched the furniture, they picked up objects, they stared at the covered mirrors and the bludgeoned bodies. The coroner eventually had to form a jury right there on the spot, literally stepping over the dead.
It's like trying to read a delicate message written in the sand after a marching band just walked over it. Whatever microscopic clues the killer left behind were literally stomped into the floorboards. It wasn't until around noon that the National Guard finally arrived from out of town to take control of the crowd and secure the house. But by then, the damage was catastrophic.
And we have to contextualize this within the era. In 1912, forensic science was in its absolute infancy. There was no DNA testing, obviously. Blood typing was a medical novelty, barely understood, and certainly not applied in rural Iowa crime scenes. The FBI's centralized fingerprint database wouldn't exist for decades. There was no established, rigorous protocol for preserving a scene of this magnitude.
How much evidence was destroyed in those 5 hours? Footprints tracked over by hundreds of leather boots, fingerprints on the doorknobs or the axe handle smudged or wiped away entirely by curious neighbors, trace materials, threads from the killer's clothing, lost in a sea of contamination. No one can say for sure what was lost.
What we do know is that by the time actual trained investigators could attempt to work the scene properly, it had been contaminated beyond all recovery. And this leads to a truly chilling sociological theory.
Yeah.
The killer, calculating and patient enough to wait in a sweltering attic for hours, almost certainly understood the limits of law enforcement at the time. They knew the psychology of a small town. They knew Villisca would react with panic and morbid curiosity. They weaponized the town's shock to their advantage, knowing the stampede of neighbors would erase whatever microscopic mistakes they might have made in the dark.
With the physical crime scene inside the house hopelessly compromised, investigators were forced to look outward. They began to cast a wider net, looking for patterns, for transient strangers, for motives that extended far beyond the town limits of Villisca. If the killer wasn't a local, who could they be?
And when you zoom out and look at the macro investigation, a terrifying pattern begins to emerge across the American Midwest during this exact time period.
Investigators discovered that Villisca was not an isolated incident. Between 1911 and 1912, an almost identical method of murder had plagued at least a dozen other towns. Axe murders. Entire families slaughtered in their beds while they slept.
But it wasn't just the weapon or the time of night that connected them. It was the staging. In places like Colorado Springs, Colorado, Blue Island, Illinois, and Paola, Kansas, investigators found scenes that were carbon copies of the Moore house.
Mirrors deliberately covered with clothing. A lamp left burning near the bodies with the chimney deliberately removed.
Right. In 2017, the renowned baseball statistician turned true crime researcher Bill James, along with his daughter Rachel McCarthy James, published a massive decade-long data study of these crimes. The book is called The Man from the Train. They applied statistical modeling to historical murder records.
And their conclusion is staggering in its scope. They proposed that all of these murders, spanning thousands of miles, including the 8 victims in Villisca, were committed by a single, highly mobile individual. A serial killer operating decades before the behavioral sciences even coined the term.
They identified a highly specific suspect, a German immigrant drifter named Paul Mueller. Mueller was a man who lived entirely on the margins of society, traveling exclusively by the vast interconnected rail network that crisscrossed the country.
His modus operandi, according to James, was terrifyingly consistent. He targeted isolated families who lived within walking distance of the railroad tracks, just like the Moores in Villisca. He would strike in the dead of night, execute the family, and vanish back into the rail network before the bodies were even discovered, let alone before investigators could mobilize and close in.
The railroad was the internet of 1912. It brought commerce, but it also brought anonymity. If the James theory is correct, the person who stood over the Moore family and the Stillinger girls had already perfected his craft. He had butchered entire families before arriving in Villisca, and he would go on to murder more after he slipped away on a morning train.
It paints a picture of a phantom riding the rails, bringing a tidal wave of slaughter to the heartland.
It is a compelling, data-driven theory. It links the geography, the specific weapon of opportunity, and the transient nature of the era perfectly. It explains how someone could vanish without a trace.
But we have to look closely at the evidence, and there is a massive flaw in applying the Paul Mueller theory strictly to Villisca.
And we must dissect this contradiction carefully because behavioral profiling demands consistency. Paul Mueller's documented history, his established MO in other crimes where he was definitively placed, was defined by two things: unspeakable brutality and lightning speed. He was a blitz attacker. He hit, he killed, and he ran. He did not linger.
But the scene in Villisca is the exact opposite of speed. The killer and the Moore house took their time. They wiped the axe. They fetched raw bacon from the kitchen. They carefully unscrewed the hot glass chimney of a kerosene lamp. They hunted down every single mirror and window and meticulously draped them in fabric.
I push back strongly against the idea that a transient drifter, terrified of the sunrise and obsessively tied to the train schedule, would pause to perform these actions. The covered mirrors, the lit lamp, the bacon, these are the antithesis of a hurried killer.
Yeah, they're the meticulous, obsessive actions of someone performing a deeply personal ritual.
Someone who felt they owned the space, at least for that night. Someone who was not just killing bodies, but attending to a complex spiritual or psychological need. Paul Mueller may have been a monster, but the staging in Villisca suggests a different breed of madness entirely.
If it wasn't a phantom escaping on a train, then investigators had to look closer to home. They had to ask, who in Villisca had the power, the resources, and the motive to orchestrate something this devastating.
Every small town has a center of gravity, a person whose wealth, connections, and influence dictate the current of the community. In Villisca, that man was State Senator Frank F. Jones.
Senator Jones was, by all accounts, the most powerful and wealthy man in town. He was a political heavyweight, heavily connected in state government, and he owned a massive retail and banking empire. And crucially, he had a very specific, highly documented reason to harbor a deep, burning hatred for Josiah Moore.
The motive is a classic, bitter tale of business betrayal. 5 years prior to the massacre, Joe Moore hadn't been an independent business owner. He'd been an employee, a clerk, working for Senator Jones's hardware and implement business. Joe was highly charismatic, exceptional at sales, and wildly ambitious.
So ambitious that he eventually left Jones's employ to start his own competing dealership right down the street. That alone would cause severe friction. But Moore didn't just leave quietly. When he opened his own doors, he managed to take the highly lucrative John Deere tractor contract away from Jones and bring it to his new business.
In an exploding farming economy in 1912, having the exclusive rights to sell John Deere equipment was essentially a license to print money. It was a massive financial blow to Senator Jones, but more importantly, it was a humiliating public defeat. The rivalry was bitter, open, and well known to everyone in Villisca. Jones, it was widely said in town, never forgave him.
Immediately after the murders, community suspicion heavily fractured. While some looked for a stranger, many locals pointed a finger directly at the senator's mansion. Ross Moore, Josiah's own brother, firmly believed Frank Jones was the architect of the slaughter. He maintained that belief until the day he died.
Joe Stillinger, the grieving father of Lena and Ina, echoed the exact same accusation. They believed Jones wanted Joe Moore dead, and the rest of the family was collateral damage to ensure there were no witnesses.
The pressure on Jones was immense. To clear his name, or perhaps, as cynics suggested, to completely control the narrative, Jones himself hired an outside investigator. He brought in a man from the famous Burns Detective Agency, a fierce rival to the Pinkertons, an investigator named James Wilkerson. His public mandate was to find the real killer and unequivocally exonerate the senator.
But the investigation took a shocking, unpredictable turn. Wilkerson, instead of clearing his employer, went rogue. He turned the investigation entirely against Senator Jones. Wilkerson loudly and publicly concluded that Jones had used his vast wealth and political connections to hire a professional hitman to eliminate the Moore family.
The hitman's name, according to Wilkerson, was William Mansfield. Wilkerson built a formidable-sounding public case. He even produced a star witness, a woman named Alice Willard, who was prepared to swear under oath that she had hidden in the shadows and overheard Senator Jones and William Mansfield explicitly plotting the murders in the woods outside of town before the massacre occurred.
Based on Wilkerson's crusade, William Mansfield was tracked down and arrested. The town braced for the trial of the century. But the case against the hitman, and by extension the powerful senator, completely collapsed under legal scrutiny.
Because Mansfield wasn't a phantom, he was a union worker with a paper trail.
Exactly. When the trial began, Mansfield's defense produced irrefutable, time-stamped payroll records. Those records proved definitively that Mansfield was working a job in the state of Illinois at the exact time the axe was swinging in Villisca.
The alibi was ironclad. Mansfield was released. The witness, Alice Willard, was thoroughly discredited on the stand. Mansfield later sued investigator James Wilkerson for defamation and malicious prosecution, and Mansfield won the lawsuit handily.
Senator Frank Jones was never criminally charged, but the court of public opinion is merciless. His political career was ruined, his reputation forever stained by the blood of the Moore family. But beyond the legal failure of the case, we have to look at the massive logical disconnect of this theory.
Exactly. Even if we entertain the idea of a political hitman, the physical crime scene completely contradicts the motive. Let's look at the behavior.
A hired gun is paid to execute a specific target, minimize risk, and disappear immediately. Why would a professional assassin, hired by a wealthy politician to settle a tractor contract dispute, crawl into a 120-degree attic and chain smoke for 4 hours?
Right. Why would a hitman wipe the blade, walk to the icebox, fetch raw bacon, and lay it on the floor?
Why would he spend an hour meticulously covering every mirror in the house with skirts and sheets? A political hitman has zero reason to perform an occult ritual. The Senator Jones theory provides a compelling motive for murder, but it provides absolutely no explanation for the madness of the scene.
Which brings us to a suspect who possessed nothing but madness. If the crime scene suggests a deranged mind, investigators didn't have to look far to find one wandering the Iowa countryside that morning.
On the morning the bodies were discovered, June 10th, a man named Andrew Sawyer appeared in the town of Creston, Iowa. Creston is about 30 miles east of Villisca along the rail line. He walked up to a foreman who was managing a railroad bridge crew.
And Sawyer's appearance was deeply unsettling. He was wearing a brown suit, but he looked like he had crawled out of a swamp. He was clean-shaven, yet his trousers and his shoes were caked in the thick, wet mud, soaking him nearly to the knees. This is the morning after a dry, cool night. Where had he been tramping through the mud?
Sawyer approached the foreman and begged for work. He was desperate, looking over his shoulder. The foreman, needing able bodies for heavy labor, hired him on the spot. Sawyer joined the crew, but his behavior quickly terrified the men around him.
As the crew traveled the rail lines over the next few days, eventually passing near the town of Villisca, Sawyer became intensely agitated. He struck up a conversation with the foreman's son, and what he said sent a chill down the young man's spine.
Sawyer reportedly pointed toward the town and claimed he knew exactly how the Villisca Axe murderer had escaped. He didn't just guess or offer a vague theory. He provided a hyper-specific step-by-step route. He said the killer ran down a specific alley behind the Moore house, vaulted over a very specific manure box, and vanished across the railroad tracks into the night.
Now wait, how could he possibly know that? This is the kind of granular geographical detail you only possess if you were running that exact route yourself. It wasn't printed in the newspapers yet. The police hadn't released an escape theory to the public. How did a muddy stranger 30 miles away know about a specific manure box in the alley behind the Moore house?
It's the ultimate red flag. And the suspicion escalated into outright terror a few days later. According to sworn witness testimony from the bridge work crew, Sawyer was acting erratically. Suddenly, he stood up, grabbed a heavy broadaxe used for shaving railroad ties, and began violently swinging it into the air.
He was making striking motions, mimicking a brutal downward attack. And as he swung the axe, he began screaming, to no one in particular, "I will cut your goddamn heads off."
The crew, fearing for their lives, subdued him and immediately turned him over to the local sheriff. Sawyer was locked up and aggressively interrogated as the prime suspect in the Villisca massacre. Think about what the police had. They had a literal madman, they had an axe, they had muddy clothes tying him to a nighttime escape, and they had impossible, specific knowledge of the crime scene's exterior.
It seemed like an open and shut case. But then, the hard facts of the timeline intervened, because the police traced Sawyer's movements over the previous 48 hours, and they hit a brick wall. Andrew Sawyer had a rock-solid, police-verified alibi.
On the night of June 9th, the exact night the Moore family was slaughtered. Sawyer had been arrested for vagrancy in the town of Osceola. He was sitting in a jail cell, or under the direct supervision of a law enforcement officer, miles away from Villisca. Furthermore, the police records showed that the sheriff in Osceola had personally placed Sawyer on a train heading out of town away from Villisca late that night.
The timeline was irrefutable. Andrew Sawyer could not have physically been in the Moore house between midnight and 5 a.m. He was released from custody. The suspect with the muddy knees and the swinging axe walked free.
But this leaves us with an incredibly unsettling, lingering mystery. If Andrew Sawyer was demonstrably innocent, if he was miles away when the axe fell, how in God's name did he know the exact escape route the killer took through that alley?
Was he a madman who simply guessed correctly, visualizing a scenario that happened to be true? Or did he cross paths with the real killer in the dark along the muddy tracks in the hours after the slaughter and hear a confession?
It is a loose thread that dangles in the dark, entirely unexplained by official records.
This brings us to the most heavily scrutinized suspect in the entire century-long investigation. If we're looking for a suspect who bridges the gap between the physical brutality of the murders and the bizarre, ritualistic staging of the house, we must examine the man of God who walked into Villisca that weekend.
Reverend George Lynn Jacqueline Kelly. He was a traveling Presbyterian minister, a man who rode the circuit, visiting small congregations across the Midwest. He arrived in Villisca on June 8th, just 2 days before the murders.
His purpose for being in town was directly tied to the victims. He was invited to help teach and observe at the Children's Day service at the Presbyterian Church, the exact same church the Moore family attended.
On the evening of June 9th, Reverend Kelly was sitting in that sanctuary. He was present for the entire program. He watched Josiah and Sarah Moore. He watched the Moore children perform their recitations. He watched 12-year-old Lena and 8-year-old Ina Stillinger sing. He had his eyes on every single victim just hours before they died.
And his movements after the service are deeply suspicious. Kelly did not stay in Villisca the following day. He left town on the very first train out, the 5:19 a.m. train, departing the morning of June 10th.
This is a critical timestamp. Mary Peckham didn't cross the lawn and knock on the Moore's door until 7 Baham a.m. The bodies weren't officially discovered, and the town wasn't alerted until hours later. Yet, multiple witnesses aboard that 5:19 a.m. train testified to a chilling interaction with the Reverend.
Kelly was reportedly agitated, talkative, and highly animated. He engaged his fellow passengers in intense conversation, and during that train ride, he explicitly told them that 8 people had been butchered in their beds in Villisca.
He announced a massacre that the rest of the world wouldn't discover for another 3 hours. Foreknowledge of a crime is the brightest red flag in an investigator's playbook. How did he know?
The investigation into Reverend Kelly peeled back the layers of a deeply troubled man. He was described by acquaintances as peculiar, intense, and prone to bizarre behavior. Medical records and testimonies revealed that Kelly had suffered a severe mental breakdown as a young man.
His behavior toward women and young girls was also highly suspect. He had been repeatedly accused of inappropriate conduct, specifically asking young women to pose nude for him, claiming it was for artistic or religious purposes. He was a man fighting profound internal demons, walking a razor's edge between religious fervor and predatory obsession.
The circumstantial evidence continued to mount. The week after the murders, Reverend Kelly sent a shirt to a local laundry in a neighboring town. The launderer noted that the shirt was heavily stained with what appeared to be dried blood.
But the most explosive piece of evidence against Kelly came from his own mouth. After hours of intense interrogation by detectives, and we must acknowledge the brutal interrogation tactics of the 1910s, Reverend George Kelly broke. He signed a comprehensive, sworn confession admitting to the murders of the Moore family and the Stillinger girls.
He was tried for the crime not once, but twice. The first trial was a grueling affair that ultimately ended in a hung jury. The town was fiercely divided. The second trial saw his defense team successfully argue that the confession was beaten out of him, completely coerced by overzealous detectives desperate to close a highly publicized case. The second trial ended in a full acquittal. Reverend Kelly walked free.
The juries ultimately didn't believe the confession, and legally we must acknowledge his acquittal. There are indeed compelling historical reasons to believe the police heavily coerced him, feeding him details to match the scene.
But we have to look intensely at the exact wording of Kelly's original sworn statement. When asked why he slaughtered 8 people, Kelly didn't cite a robbery or a grudge or a sudden rage. He said, and this is a direct quote from the file, "A demon made me do it."
A demon made me do it. A phrase that sounds like pure theatrical madness. But let's analyze this statement through the lens of the physical evidence, the staging that we cannot explain, the ritual.
The covered mirrors, the lamp left burning with the chimney removed.
Let's unpack the cultural history here. In early 20th century rural America, Orthodox religion often lived side by side with deeply ingrained occult and European folk beliefs. These were superstitions brought over by immigrants and adapted in the isolated farming communities of the Midwest.
One of those specific folk traditions revolves around mirrors. In certain Appalachian and European folk beliefs, when a person dies, every mirror in the house must be immediately covered with a cloth.
The belief is that a mirror acts as a portal. If the soul of the newly deceased sees its reflection before it can pass on to the afterlife, it will become confused or trapped within the glass, doomed to haunt the home forever. You cover the mirrors to force the dead to leave the physical space.
And the kerosene lamp.
A burning light placed near the deceased is meant to act as a beacon. Removing the chimney makes the flame brighter, wilder, unguarded. It is a beacon to guide the wandering spirit out of the physical body and away from the earth.
A demon made me do it.
Whether Kelly was severely delusional and acting on his own twisted religious hallucinations, whether his confession was coerced by detectives who had seen the bizarre scene, or whether he was actually guilty, this brings us to a grim, inescapable realization.
Someone, whether it was Kelly or a nameless drifter, deliberately staged that occult ritual.
Yes, the ritual wasn't an accident. The killer either genuinely, terrifiedly believed in the supernatural, believed they had to protect themselves from the vengeful souls of the 6 children and 2 adults they just murdered, or they meticulously arranged that scene because they wanted the town of Villisca to believe a demon had done it. They wanted to inject a terrifying supernatural narrative into the crime to throw off the police. Either answer genuine occult belief or calculated psychological warfare is profoundly disturbing.
And that injection of the supernatural didn't end in 1912. The legacy of that ritual has clung to the property for over a century. The house itself became a vessel for the unexplained.
When you have a crime of this magnitude, completely unsolved, layered with occult staging, the location itself becomes a focal point for unresolved energy.
Let's establish the modern status of the Moore home. After the murders, the house went through a series of owners, but it never truly shook its reputation. The stain was too deep. Eventually, it was purchased and painstakingly restored to its exact 1912 condition. And I mean exact. They removed the modern electricity, they stripped out the indoor plumbing. It sits on the quiet street, looking precisely as it did the night the killer walked in.
It was placed on the National Registry of Historic Places, but more significantly, it has remained entirely devoid of permanent inhabitants for 113 years. No family has successfully reclaimed that space as a home. It is a museum of a massacre.
Today, it receives thousands of visitors a year. But it also attracts the attention of the most rigorous, technologically equipped paranormal investigation teams in the world. And we are going to strictly report their findings here, not as absolute scientific fact, but as recorded, unexplained data collected at the site.
We must treat this audio and visual data seriously, because the consistency of the findings across decades is staggering.
Let's look at the evidence gathered by TAPS, the team behind the long-running series Ghost Hunters. They conducted a massive lockdown of the house. They placed a standalone audio recorder in the attic, the exact cramped, low-ceiling space where investigators found the cigarette butts, the space where the killer waited for hours.
The TAPS team ensured the entire attic was empty. They locked the access door. They were on a completely different floor of the house when the recording was made in the dead of night.
When they reviewed the audio, isolated from the silence of the empty attic, they captured a clear EVP, an electronic voice phenomenon. It was the distinct voice of a young child. The voice asks a single, haunting question. Who are you?
Who are you? Spoken in the exact spot where a strange man hid in the dark, smoking, waiting above the heads of sleeping children. The implications of that audio capture are deeply chilling.
The investigations didn't stop there. The Ghost Adventures crew spent days inside the house. Their specialized equipment documented multiple EVPs that appeared to explicitly say the names of the Moore children. Their thermal imaging cameras captured distinct, human-shaped heat signatures moving independently across rooms that were physically empty. These shapes could not be attributed to reflections, drafts, or the investigators themselves.
The paranormal lockdown team spent 72 continuous hours sealed inside the restored house. Their documentation included massive, instantaneous temperature drops and closed rooms drops that defy environmental physics. They recorded heavy, physical objects moving across the floor without any human contact. They captured auditory phenomena, footsteps, heavy breathing recorded on multiple independent devices placed in different rooms simultaneously, proving the sounds were spatial and moving through the house.
But there is one piece of phenomenon that stands above the rest: the climax of the evidence. It is something reported by multiple, completely independent investigation teams across multiple visits, spanning a period of over 20 years.
It is an event that occurs with terrifying regularity, a haunting that runs on a schedule.
Between 1:00 a.m. and 2:00 a.m., the exact window of time medical examiners estimate the slaughter began, the town of Villisca is quiet. But just outside of town, the modern freight trains still run the tracks, just as they did in 1912.
When that 1:00 a.m. train passes by, its heavy whistle echoing through the dark Iowa night, something profound changes inside the Morehouse. It is as if the sound of the whistle acts as a trigger, winding up a horrific clock.
Now, I have to be skeptical here. Could the fog or the shifting atmosphere just be a localized pressure drop from the acoustic wave of the train horn, a physical vibration moving the dust?
It's a valid scientific hypothesis, but the visual evidence defies it. Investigators positioned throughout the dark house describe the sudden appearance of a thick, localized fog. But it is not atmospheric fog. It cannot be explained by humidity, weather conditions, or pressure differentials. It is a dense visual anomaly that manifests indoors, unaffected by the physics of the house.
And it does not just sit in the room. The fog moves. It drifts purposefully through the house. It starts near the stairwell. It moves upstairs into the master bedroom. From there, it drifts into the children's rooms. Then, it descends the staircase, moving into the downstairs parlor, and finally into the guest room where the Stillinger sisters slept.
It moves through the house in the exact sequence, room by room, that the killer walked with the axe. 20 years of independent teams. 20 years of the same train whistle. 20 years of the fog walking the killer's path.
Which brings us to our final synthesis. What does the evidence of Case File 3 actually tell us? Let's summarize the hard truths that remain unshakable after a century.
First, the physical evidence proves premeditated entry. The cigarette butts in the attic are undeniable proof that the killer was in the house before the family arrived. They hid, they waited, and they planned. Second, the killer opportunistically used the home's own weapon. Josiah Moore's axe was the instrument of their destruction. This implies either an intimate knowledge of the property or a terrifying adaptability.
But most importantly, the hard truth is that none of the conventional theories cleanly explain the ritual staging.
Exactly. The serial killer theory gives us a pattern of violence across the Midwest, but Paul Mueller's blitz attacks do not explain a killer who stops to drape skirts over mirrors and lay bacon on the floor.
The vengeful senator theory gives us a powerful motive. Frank Jones hated Josiah Moore enough to want him ruined. But a hired hitman does not sit in a sweltering attic for 4 hours or perform an occult ritual after the job is done.
And the delusional reverend theory gives us a suspect who confessed to hearing demons and had foreknowledge of the crime. But Reverend Kelly's mental state makes his confession utterly unreliable, leaving us wondering if he was the architect of the ritual or simply a broken man projecting his madness onto an existing tragedy.
None of them fit perfectly. The puzzle is missing a piece. The ritual remains unexplained. But before we close this file, consider this final thought. We assume the killer covered the mirrors to keep the spirits of the dead from trapping themselves in the glass, following the old European folk logic. But what if the ritual wasn't occult at all? What if it was a desperate, deeply human act of psychological self-preservation? What if the killer covered the mirrors not to hide the dead, but to prevent themselves from accidentally catching a glimpse of their own reflection, to avoid seeing the face of the monster they had just become?
I mean, that is a truly terrifying thought.
It is. I want to know what you think. You've heard the evidence, you've walked the timeline, you've stood in the shadowed rooms with the covered mirrors, the lamp, the deliberate, macabre staging in a murder scene in a farmhouse in Iowa in 1912.
Who held the axe? Was it the pattern killer, the man from the train riding the rails and bringing chaos to the heartland? Was it the broken reverend acting on a terrifying break from reality, commanded by a demon?
Was it the hitman, paid by a corrupt politician, who simply improvised a ritual to throw off the police? Or is it something else entirely? A suspect never named, a motive never discovered, an evil that slipped away into the morning fog.
Tell me in the comments. I read every one. I want to see how you weigh the options.
If this investigation is the kind of thing you want more of, cases where the crime and the unexplained meet in a place neither side can fully claim, then subscribe. New case files drop regularly. Everyone goes somewhere the official records didn't. Case file 4 is already open.
In 1959, 9 highly experienced, physically fit hikers died on the slopes of a freezing mountain in the Soviet Union. Their tents were slashed open from the inside. Their bodies were found scattered in the snow, some bearing inexplicable internal injuries that mirrored high-speed car crashes, yet with no external trauma.
The Soviet government's official investigation closed the case with a single, chilling conclusion. It remains the actual documented verdict on their death certificates to this day. They were killed by an unknown compelling force. Next time, we'll look at what that force might have been.
Case closed for now?